number of attendees, I think over 75, who wanted to participate. So I want to give them a little bit of time to join, but I also want to be respectful of everyone who was here on time. So maybe give them another minute or two and then go forward. If you get a moment, if you see on the right side of your screen, or at least on the right side of my screen, there's what they call a chat pod. If you can just type in there, if you're able to see me and see the slides and hear me and everything, that would give me some good guidance going forward. So if you get a chance, just go ahead and do that, please. Okay. Hey, thank you so much. It's good because one of those things, as those of you who've done webinars know, sometimes, especially in this case, you don't know if things are working. You think they are, but they may or may not be. So let's go ahead. Thanks, Christina and Michelle. Absolutely perfect. Like I said, we'll give them one more minute and we'll go ahead and get started. Those of you, actually everyone who's going to be on the webinar should have received the slides by email in advance within the last hour or so. If you didn't, just let me know, please, and I'll make sure that you do get a copy. All right. It looks like we've got a good enough group to go ahead and get started. Because again, I want to be respectful of everybody's time who certainly is overscheduled at the least and has made the time to join in this. So thank you very much for participating. And as you know, we're going to be talking about Chile's decree number 57 from 2019. And that decree is titled The Regulation on Classification, Labeling, and Notification of Hazardous Chemicals and Mixtures. It's a mouthful, and that's why I'm going to refer to it as Decree 57 as we go through the presentation. And I'm going to highlight this on one of the earlier slides. But keep in mind or pay attention to specifically the fact that it talks about three different things. It's a regulation talking about the classification of hazardous chemicals and mixtures, about the labeling of hazardous chemicals and mixtures, and also the notification of hazardous chemicals and mixtures. So I say that to say it does a lot of things. And as we go through, I'm going to try to remember to explain it as clearly as I can. But you'll see a lot of different deadlines. You'll see a deadline for GHS compliance. You'll see a deadline for notification of new substances. So keep in mind, we're looking at multiple topics as we go through this. So just for some housekeeping things, please mute your microphone if you haven't already. Hello, Fabio. Some of you have seen already the chat box. And again, on my screen, it's on the right side. If you want to add any comments in as we're going, if you have questions specifically or you want to make a comment, please put it in there. I'll try my best to answer in real time, but because I'm trying to stick to a schedule, I may not get to it either right away or not get to it all. Don't worry, I'm going to record all the questions. They'll be written down, and I'll send them out by email within probably 48 hours, definitely by the end of the day, US time on Friday. One thing I key in on here, and I want to key in again as we go forward, is because of what I just said on the previous slide about it being so complicated, so complex, the format we're going to go through is not intended to be exhaustive. I don't intend for you to walk away and say, I got Decree 57 figured out 100%. That's not my intent. Because there are so many moving parts, I want to just make you aware of what's required and some of the requirement deadlines. And then from that, you can maybe spend some more time in it, ask me some questions. I'll be happy to answer you and actually dig a little bit more deeply into it with your teams and your various businesses. And then, again, I sent you the PDF of these slides. The recording and the slides are always going to be available on our YouTube channel. For those of you that have participated before in webinars, I think we have 5 up there now. This might be the 6th, if I'm remembering correctly. The link is there. The links do work in the PDF, so you don't have to worry about writing it down and trying to get it in your notes pretty quickly. Because the issue is so complex and because I've been told I talk very quickly, which, again, is probably part of my upbringing, a lot of people say, I didn't get everything. I want to go back and review stuff. And this way I figure it's on the YouTube channel. You could play it, stop it, pause it as much as you want, and make sure you really retain that information. So for those of you that I haven't had a chance to meet before, I am the president and director of M4 Global Consulting, LLC. We're based here in Atlanta in the United States. I myself have over 25 years at various levels in global chemical companies as manager and director of global and also regional teams. I've been a published author of over a dozen professional articles. I've written 2 books on various topics, one on eco-management and audit scheme in Europe, which is kind of like ISO, but it's also kind of fallen out of favor as the years have gone on since I wrote it. And then in 2018, I published a handbook, Chemical Regulation in the Middle East, which I designed for people new to the region from a regulatory standpoint and had it focused on specific areas, key countries. And then with each of those key countries, things that would be necessary to know. For example, who are the competent authorities? What are the chemical regulations? What are the health and safety regulations? What are waste disposal regulations? So I think you can read some chapters online for free, and I would encourage you to do that because I think it's a really well laid out book. And finally, I've had the opportunity to be speaking globally on various topics, including Central and South America in this case, and then also the Middle East. And then just one quick slide for those of you that aren't familiar with the company. We are based, as I said, again, here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the US. And there's a couple things that we really pride ourselves on. And the first one I think is maybe most critical to me is our knowledge and our expertise. And I talked about it a moment ago, but I come from 25 plus years in industry in significant roles, director roles, and so on like that. So one of the things I think we bring to your table when we have meetings with you is we can understand and talk technically with the people in your business units. Some consultants, and this is not an insult, this is just a statement of fact, some consultants really just tend to focus on what the regulations are. You must do this and you must do that. Whereas coming from the business side of things for all those years, I've had the ability both in business and also as a consultant to be able to sit down with your purchasing group and say, these are things you need to worry about when you're purchasing raw materials from company X or you're shipping to country Y. I can talk with your sales and marketing people. You know, these are the things you may want to say on your product label, but these are really maybe a better way to do it, or you just, certain cases, you just can't say these things for different various reasons. Worked very closely over the years with R&D people, and I was always involved in the very beginning, and my team was involved in the beginning. So when your R&D people say, hey, I have this new formulation I'd like to sell in, let's say, Chile, and they don't know what to do, I have the technical knowledge that I can talk with them about the chemistries, the formulations, things like that. So I think that's something we definitely bring to the table. And then just really quickly here, you see some of the registrations that we've done or notifications we've done in Latin America and the Middle East. Some of the more recent ones, one that we're very proud of, disinfectant in Mexico with COVID-19 claims. We got that when it first came out, and it was a challenge because nobody really knew which way the regulatory scheme was going to go, and we were able to get that through for a client. And we operate in 66 countries, and you see here the different types of things we do. So we do biocide registrations, food contact, consumer goods. We are registered agents in many of those countries, and those where we're not, we have relationships with law firms who can be your registered agent if you need. Many countries, as you well know, you need an in-country representative to make notifications. We can certainly help you with that. And we can do regulatory training, just like we've done here. You have a group that wants to go into Mexico. They don't know what they don't know. Happy to do a training for you and tell you the things you need to be aware of, specific to your company and specific to your products. Okay. So I want to start with the historical view of Chilean chemical regulations. And the reason I want to do that is because when you look at Decree 57, again, it's very unwieldy. There's a lot of things in there. And you're probably saying, you know, why is it so complicated? Why isn't there a GHS regulation and a chemical substance notification labeling and, you know, transport labeling regulation? And this is why. When we look at NCH period, that's the abbreviation in Spanish for Normas Chilenas, which means Chilean standards. So in Chile and also in other areas of South America, they don't necessarily have regulation numbers. Like they'll have Decree 57, but as they're developing the standards that go with Decree 57 in this case, and all decrees, they come up with Chilean standards first. You see that also in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East. So you start with the standard, and then you use the standard to either create the regulation and or you incorporate the standard into the regulation itself. So all these things that I'm showing you have been folded into Decree 57. So there's a Norma 382 from 2021. And if you don't know the numbering system in South America, generally you'll have Norma, you'll have NCH, you'll have NOM in Mexico, and then you'll have the number of the regulation by a slash, and then the year that the regulation was introduced. So here it's regulation, it's the 382nd regulation of 2021, but you see, obviously there have been updates to it. So that's how you read that. 382 of 2021 talks about dangerous goods and how you ship and how you follow the multimodal transport regulations and so on as per the UN. So that existed prior to Decree 57 coming into place. There was a separate labeling standard, 2190 of 2019. Yeah, I think there was a typo, but it's not. It was Decree 57 is what replaced it. So there was a labeling standard that was different from any other standard they had in place. There was a decree that talked about how you store hazardous substances. and there was a specific regulation relative to GHS in Chile. And I want to call your attention specifically to how it's bolded there, the 8th revision, because as we'll go through, we see that Chile in Decree 57 never really says what revision of the Purple Book they're using. From looking through it, it appears that they use revision 7 pretty much, but it's not consistent. And then you see here previously the regulation used the 8th version. So again, it's not specified, so we're trying to make our best educated guess, but there are at least 2 different versions that they're using. So then we talk about Decree 57 just as a whole before we start breaking it down. You can see the title there, the official title. And when I give you regulations in another language, whether it's here or the Middle East, whatever, I'll always give you the actual, in this case, Spanish title, in case you're looking it up on the website and so on in Spanish. And I'll also give you the the English version of the name, so you can go in and put that down as well. Chile has an official gazette like the Federal Register does, and they published this back on 9th of February of 2021. Now you're saying, well, it says Decree 57 of 2019, and now you're talking about Decree 57 of 2021. That's because when it was published, there was a phase-in period where industry got to comment, they got to give their opinions, they had questions. It's basically like notice and comment in the United States. So that's why you see a difference there between 57 of 2019 and 57 of 2021, but it is actually now in force. And then from that date, from that February 9th of 2021 date, they calculate 2 different entries into force date, 2 different aspects of when the regulation is going to come into force, when it's going to apply. So one of the things it does, Decree 57 does, is it talks about implementing GHS, Globally Harmonized System of Classification and Labeling, in Chile. So one part of Decree 57 is talking about how you implement GHS, how you classify, and we'll spend time on this. And it has its own set of deadlines for complying with GHS. Another part of Decree 57, as I said earlier, talks about having a chemical inventory and chemical reporting system. So again, you're going to have 2 separate topics, 2 separate sets of requirements, 2 separate implementation dates, phase-in schedules, and so on. And again, I realize it's complicated. That's why I wanted to give you the slides first, so you can say, okay, let me read through this and see if it maybe makes more sense than we have in 45 minutes or whatever the time is. It's a joint effort, and you see this a lot in South America, certainly, between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Environment. In South America, a lot of ministries will often share requirements for different standards. So you may have to go to the Ministry of Health when you're talking about your GHS. You may go to the Ministry of Environment when you're talking about chemicals and chemical substances. It also makes Chile the first country in Latin America to actually have a chemicals notification scheme. Some of you will know Mexico's been thinking about it since at least 2012, and supposedly they're getting there. Brazil's been talking about it and so on, and has a little bit of that in place. But the actual one to first implement the entire scheme in South America is Chile. And as I talked about earlier, it's very complex, so we're just going to look at it from a high-level overview, give you a sense of what's involved. So it's a long regulation, 146 pages in Spanish and 203 pages when you translate it into English. And you see here it's 7 titles and 243 articles. So again, really takes a lot of time to dig through if you want to spend some time in it. Main thing to focus on, actually I said 7 titles, it looks like there's 8 there. Those are the categories of titles in the regulation itself. So you see it talks about hazard classification, talks about GHS, talks about safety data sheets. We'll spend some time on that. What does a Chilean safety data sheet have to look like now? Risk assessments is going to be a big thing. You'll certainly want to pay attention to that. And then just at the end, oversight and sanctions for non-compliance. So that's what we're going to talk about here. And you see at the bottom of the screen, it says does not cover in black letters, talking about Decree 57. The things in there, it's too long to go through right now, but the things in there are what it does not cover, the things that are not applicable to Decree 57. So for example, pharmaceutical products are in there. I think there's active ingredients for somewhere in there for pesticides and so on. Those are not included. Generally speaking, it's because they're regulated by other statutes. So Chile does have a pesticide statute, a biocide statute, does have statutes that talk about cosmetics, of course. So those things are regulated elsewhere, and that's why they're exempted from the regulation. This is actually an exhaustive list. These are the things from the regulation, so we didn't cut anything out or excerpt it. This is the official list of what is not covered under Decree 57. So in Decree 57, if you want to sum it up into one sentence, at least the notification part, manufacturers and importers, both of them, who manufacture or import hazardous substances, and that's defined in Decree 57, in greater than 1 ton per year are subject to the regulation, presuming you're not exempted like we just saw on the previous slide. The interesting thing when you read Decree 57 is that it talks about manufacturers and importers, but not in the way you might think. Here in Decree 57, the manufacturers of a substance over 1 ton per year have responsibilities for notification, and the company importing it, assuming they're different, has responsibility for notification if they import over 1 ton per year. Not quite sure why that is, but that is how it's written in the regulation. It would seem duplicative to me. You're reporting the same volume twice. But again, in the regulation, that's how it is specifically laid out. And again, you have that 1 ton per year threshold. That's only what you have to report if you exceed. Submissions must be made electronically through the Ministry of Environment portal. And you see the link there. And I said it before, but for new people, the hyperlinks in the PDFs that I sent you do work. So you can click on there and see. You have to register and so on. But that is how Chile is going to decide if your substance is notified/registered or not. There is no paper option. There's no any other option. It has to be through that specific portal. And the initial notification has to be completed before the timelines that we'll see below and updated every 2 years. So again, it's something we're generally familiar with in various countries of the world. So when Chile in Decree 57 talks about a new substance, it's non-exempt, meaning it wasn't on the previous slide, hazardous chemical substances that are not included in the resolution of notified substances. Just put that aside for right now. We're going to go into that in more detail. Basically, the resolution of notified substances is a list Chile has put out and done hazard classifications for. We don't really do that in the United States, but some other countries tend to do that. They say, for example, adipic acid. The country authority comes up with a classification that you must use on your product label. So that's kind of what they're talking about here when they talk about the resolution of notified substances. But again, we'll spend more time on that later. And just to state the obvious, maybe new substances have to be import notified prior to doing any of those things. You can't import, for example, an R&D sample. There isn't a provision in the regulation for R&D samples, let's say, or trial material. You have to notify before you bring in any quantity as long as it's above that 1 ton per year. And I realize that may sound confusing to you, but in certain cases in industry, from my experience, a sample for a paper mill, for example, may need to be more than 1 ton to get it to see if it works properly. It might be 2 tons, might be 2.5 tons. So depending on your volume, you may exceed that. The implementation dates for the chemical registration, the chemical notification, note I said not for GHS. Remember I said in the beginning, there are 2 different sets of requirements. For chemical notification, it breaks it down into 4 different categories that you can see here, and they each have their own implementation date. So if you have a pure substance used for an industrial use, by February 9th of 2024, you have to make that notification. But if you have a mixture of a product that's a mixture for industrial use, you get an extra 3 years from that deadline. That's the 9th of February, 2027. And then, of course, non-industrial substances and non-industrial mixtures, the same kind of thing. So one word of advice is know your products. When you're talking with your purchasing people or your R&D people, is this a pure substance or is this a mixture? Because that gives you a big difference, 3 years, in terms of when you may need to notify your product. And we talked about Decree 57 having a 1 ton or more threshold. And we said here also manufacturers and importers have to both submit information. You can't just say, well, I'm the manufacturer, my importer brought in X, so I'm just going to say X. You have to report it in this case, or most cases, twice. We'll talk about GHS here in a second. When you have a substance that's contained in a mixture, so remember on the previous slide, we saw 2 dates for mixtures. You only have to notify 2 things for the substances in the mixtures. You have to determine if they present a risk to the environment and health. And at the end of the presentation, we'll see a flow chart where you can make that decision. And in paragraph 2 of Title 2 of the regulation, if their concentrations are greater than the cutoff values that are listed in that section of the regulation. And I'll show you an example of what they use for cutoff values because it is quite different from a lot of the cutoff values that we might be used to. So when you're making a submission for chemical notification under Decree 57, just some interesting things here to highlight for you, some administrative things, nothing really earth-shattering there. But under the substance information, I want to call out two things. First is there right now is no language in the regulation for CBI, confidential business information. That may come over time, but as it's written right now, there is no provision to mark things confidential when you submit to the authority. So again, just something from a business standpoint to be aware of. Your data is not necessarily protected. I don't know if they have the equivalent of FOIA or something in Chile, but there's no obligation by the ministries to keep your data confidential. Also, if you look down towards the end of that substance information list, you see they want some very specific data up front in addition to the information they require. So they want acute oral tox data. They want dermal corrosivity data. They want that up front before you make, as part of the submission you make. Whereas some regulatory schemes around the world, you make the submission, they say, well, we're not really comfortable with the pH or some of the other things in this product, so we want you to do, for example, an ocular corrosivity study. These are the things that must be submitted up front. So again, when you're talking to people in your business, there's going to be some cost involved if you don't already have these studies generated to get them generated for submission. And then as we talked about a little bit ago, you see the Ministry of Environment will not give authorization on any substances that are not submitted through that electronic portal. So again, just to reiterate, there is no other way. If people, I know somebody in the country that can physically walk it to the ministry. No, it has to be done through that particular ministry. Fabio's outside companies that export to Chile do not have to notify their products, but their customers do. It depends how it's set up. And I say that without going into the details of how you may have transfer agreements or something. Someone has to make that notification. So if the manufacturer is shipping it to Chile and the customer is the importer of record, then you would still both have to submit. If there's some other way you're talking about, just put it in the chat, please, and I'll try to clarify that. But really, it's got to be the manufacturer and the importer, unless they're both the same person or same company. This is something where Decree 57 diverges a little bit from what we're seeing in some other countries, for example, the US and I believe Canada, but I'm not sure, with respect to GHS, is the ministry is going to define by August of this year what they consider to be chemicals of interest. And for those chemicals of interest, they're going to say these you are required to complete a risk assessment, you, the company, in order to help us evaluate your product more. They'll come up with this list of chemicals of interest. They'll release it as part of what they call their risk evaluation resolution. And those risk assessments with the parameters that will be defined in the resolution, you must do this kind of risk assessment. They have to be performed by the manufacturer or the importer. Some countries in South America will say, we want to do it because we feel more comfortable with the data set we get than if maybe you did it, you company. That's not the case here. The companies need to do it. And as you see here, that resolution will talk about what specifically you need to do for the risk assessment, as well as whether it is what makes it a chemical of interest. So only if you fall as a chemical of interest on this list when it's published, do you need to do those risk assessments. So Decree 57, remember the initial notification, we saw a few slides again for the substances, is 30th of August, 2024. From that data that's submitted, the Ministry of Environment is going to use that data to create their new chemical substances inventory. So kind of like, I'm trying to remember back, I think it was REACH did this. They said, you can pre-register substances and get them on, and then basically that will form the inventory. That's what Chile is saying here by the end of this year. Actually, I should say 2024. I'm sorry, it's 31st December 2024. They will create the inventory based on the submissions that are in. So if you want to get something on the inventory, it's to your advantage to submit that notification as soon as possible. That's not to say they won't regulate your substance, but it gives you a chance to get on the inventory and at least have your product or your substance in the market and notified as you go forward. It makes it a lot easier to add on to it rather than have to go and do the full notification process after August of 2024. Now, again, we switched before now we're talking about GHS classifications, which is different from the substance notifications. GHS classification, remember GHS is part of the classification and labeling part of Decree 57. there are specific deadlines for GHS implementation. And one of them, I highlighted in red because I'm not sure how many people are aware of it. The GHS regulation for labeling and safety data sheets for industrial substances has already passed. It came into force on February 9th. So we're about 2 months past that. Again, they're getting up to speed with Decree 57. I wouldn't feel comfortable saying they're not going to penalize you for not having a GHS label and safety data sheet for your industrial substance, but I think they also realize that there is a transition period and people learning about it and coming into compliance. So I say that to say, if you're not shipping your industrial product to Chile right now with a GHS safety data sheet and label, I think that's something you really want to pay attention to. So also in Decree 57, we talked about this earlier, Decree 57 also created as a subpart, let's say, to it, a separate regulation, Resolution 777. So you've got Decree 57 that talks about everything we've talked about so far, and then Decree 57 created Resolution 777 that talks about the minimum ways to classify your product in terms of GHS. So we'll see a flow chart here on the next slide that'll probably make more sense to it. You can also use, you see, classifications we talked about very early on, the original GHS classification, but 777 expands it, whereas the beginning 382 is, this is what you can do. Now they've gone in and they've expanded it more to how you can classify different substances. So it's much better, I think, for industry to have a larger tool in this case. I'll say this to say, and it'll become clear on the next slide, I think, you have the ability to challenge these categorizations. And again, it'll make more sense when we see the flowchart diagram. You don't have to say, well, ministry says my product needs to be classified this way. That's all I can do. You have the ability to essentially appeal it and show them documentation and make your case and so on. But we'll hold that off for a little bit now. The manufacturers and importers must update it within 6 months of knowing the information. So if you realize now, I didn't know it was a inhalation hazard to the degree that it is, you have to update the information to the Chilean authorities and also update your label and update your safety data sheet. Searchable by CAS number, I've looked at it. It is an extensive document. I want to say it's 4,000 substances. I want to say it's 781 pages. I mean, but it is, for what it is, it's very manageable. It's very searchable. They're searchable by CAS number. The chemical names are in Spanish. So if you're looking for English versions, again, of adipic acid or something, you'll find the Spanish translation, but you can certainly search by CAS number, and that should help you find what you need. It includes specific concentration limits, all the other things here in that decree. So you really want to take a look at that. Oh, there it is. I didn't realize I wrote it out. There's a link to the substance classification limit, Resolution 777. If you want to take some time and look at it, click on the hyperlink. And yeah, they've really done their homework, Chile. They've over 4,000 substances that they've classified. So on the one hand, it's good because you know what the classifications are, and you can just go ahead and put those on your sheets and your labels. On the other hand, if you disagree with them, it may be a more arduous process to challenge them. But for 4,000 substances, they've done the classifications for you, and they'll be checked again every 2 years. So here's an example of Resolution 777, that official list we just talked about and had the link to, the substance classifications. Here's literally the first, what is that, 6 lines of the table. So you see, they have the chemical name, as I said, in Spanish, not in English, your CAS number, the classification to use. So for example, for that particular one with CAS number 198705, the classification you must use, unless you're going to challenge it with the authority, is aquatic chronic 4. That must be on your label. You can't say chronic 3. You can't do anything along those lines. It must be aquatic chronic 4 in this case, and it must have the H statement of H413. Again, looking to the right, limits of concentration and M factors. It doesn't have any restrictions there, and also no notes. So here you just have to worry about column 3 and column 4. Yes, non-Chilean manufacturers can appoint and actually have to appoint an only representative, but it's not officially called an only representative like under REACH, for example. It's basically an agent in the country because they need a Chilean national to go ahead and actually submit and electronically sign the submissions. So yes, that's exactly what you need in the country, but again, not an OR exactly like you might be familiar with under REACH in Europe. Okay, that same resolution, 777, it seems to follow Europe's CLP regulation, their Annex 6 entries, but double check it. As I was skimming it, a lot matched up, but there were also situations where it didn't match up. So make sure you don't say, well, it seems like it's following CLP, so I'm just going to take the CLP classification and put it into Chile. That doesn't always work. Sometimes, yes, but I've found instances where it doesn't. And then substances that are not specified on that official list, so that not those 4,000 substances that are there, need to go back to Decree 57 and, using the hazard criteria that's in there in Decree 57, come up with a classification. So again, I always make the joke, but it's true. When you're talking about GHS, it's not global, it's not harmonized, but it is a system. And the same thing happens with Chile. Remember, I said in the beginning, they use revision 7, they use revision 8. So you can't just say, well, this is how we classify it in Europe or in the United States. It probably is close enough. You have to look at Decree 57 categories of classification and go ahead and follow those when you make your notification document. So this is what I alluded to a moment ago, and I put it in because I think it's particularly instructive. You see the kind of the flowchart process. When you're doing your hazard class, we talked about you can have substances, mixtures, cutoff values we'll talk about here in a second. And then based on the flow chart, first point of the flow chart would be, is the substance on that official list, on that list of 4,000 plus substances? And if it's not, then as we said a moment ago, you go back to Decree 57, you create your classification. If it is on that list, you use the list of 4,000, Decree 7, Resolution 777, and you just take that classification that's presented there. I like the flow chart where it says, yes, but it's on the list, but you don't agree with that official classification. This is what we talked about. If you don't agree with it and you want to classify something as less restrictive, you can see here, you have to submit documentation to the Ministry of Health. And we've already started looking at that process. We can certainly help you with that. And they have 90 business days, not 90 calendar days, 90 business days to come back to you with a consideration or evaluation. That's interesting because if you've worked in South America at all, you know that generally speaking, by statute, there aren't timeframes for authorities to respond to you. It's, we will try to do it in 30 days, but there's nothing in statute that says, you must do it, agency, in 30 days in that example. If for some reason their classification is less restrictive and you want to make it more restrictive, and depending on your knowledge of the chemistry and so on, you may want to, that's certainly fine. There it's automatically accepted. So you don't have to get permission from the ministry to say, well, you call it an acute 4, I want to call it an acute 5. They just say, that's fine. As long as you're not trying to make it less restrictive, we don't necessarily have to have a discussion with you. We talked a little bit about cutoff values, and just to give you an example here from the regulation, when they talk about what those cutoff values are. And as I said earlier, some follow global regulations, some don't. Just the example, for example, of carcinogenicity greater than or equal to 0.1%. That tends to follow most of the regulations around the world, but some of these other in here may not. And we'll see that in a moment on a different slide. But just to give you a sense of, there are specific cutoff values listed, so pay attention to them when you're doing your classification. 28 hazard classes exist in Decree 57. So depending on the country that you're watching from or countries that you're working in, you may not have this many hazard classes. So again, don't assume in Europe under CLP we have this many hazard classes. It's the same here. It may be, it may not be. And then just, this is what I call the cheat sheet for Decree 57. Instead of having you page through what I said, 180 some pages, I forget, of the regulation, here's kind of a cheat sheet where you can find the hazard class that you're looking at and the specific articles that you can go to that will talk about that hazard class and how to do the classifications, what the criteria are, and so on. And then all 28, like I said, are listed. We've talked about this briefly, but here's an actual example of it. We've talked about how it partially aligns with GHS Revision 7, but then remember on one of the first slides, they said, well, we're going to look at doing Revision 8 of GHS. It's kind of confusing. It's between the two. So I just said, well, they talk about GHS Revision 7 in the regulation, so I'm going to highlight the key differences from 7. Now, again, if you go to 8, these may be different, but you see them here. And you see in red what Decree 57 does not include. So for example, if you have a classification that you've done in your country where you have a flammable gas category 1B, Decree 57 does not include that category. If you have aspiration hazard category 1B, Decree 57 does not include or does not recognize that hazard. So when you're doing your classification, maybe that makes it a little bit easier because you don't have to worry how do they translate in terms of cutoff values and so on. They just say, you know what, we've chosen these building blocks. We're not going to follow them. That's just how we have decided to go in Chile. So it's not everything. It's only 8 or so, maybe 9 categories, but key in on these differences. Don't just assume because your classification elsewhere is like this, it must be like that. Talking a bit for a moment about labeling under Decree 57, you see the bullet points here. There is no particular order that these items have to be in, but they have to be included. And the question I always get is, in the local language, yes, they must be in Spanish. Now, I've heard informally from the Ministry of Environment that they will also accept English on the label. But in the decree itself, it doesn't say anything about additional languages. It just says much must be in Spanish. So make sure that when you're printing labels and talking with your marketing and salespeople that they realize primary language has to be in Spanish for shipping product down there. Just again, things you see on here, very significant single word hazard statements. Couple points I want to draw your attention to. The first one is there must be a contact information that can usually is a phone number. I imagine it could be a website, but usually it's done as a phone number for a toxicological center that has specifically 24/7 access in Chile. So you unpack that a little bit. It has to be a toxicological center, so a entity that is available to answer toxicology questions about the product. It can't just be those of you in the United States, for example, Chemtrek, where you have a spill and you call and they give you information about the hazards and so on in general. Here, it has to be a specific toxicological center. They have to be open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Somebody has to physically pick up the phone, and it has to be located in Chile. So the question I've been getting as I've done some of these trainings is, well, what if we have a tox center with 24/7 service in Atlanta, Georgia, United States? Doesn't work. It has to be in Chile. That's specific in the regulation. But then a follow-on note, one of the things I've been able to do as I've been coming to terms with this regulation is I have established a relationship with a toxicological center in Chile who is being set up to do just that. And we've had some meetings, we've had some conversations. So if you need a recommendation, we can certainly point you in that direction to set up that relationship going forward. I didn't discuss with the company costs or contracts or anything. I just said, hey, I'm going to have clients that need this. Are you available to do this for external non-Chilean business entities? And they said yes, and they have the capability to do what's required by the decree. Nanomaterials, I'm just reading the question here. What about nanomaterials? Are there any nano-specific requirements in the regulation? The regulation is silent on nanomaterials. It doesn't say they're exempt. It doesn't say that they're regulated. So that's one of those interesting questions where if I was your consultant and you asked me that question, I would call the Ministry of Environment and say, hey, I've got a client who wants to know about nanomaterials. Doesn't seem to be in the regulation. Can you give me any guidance? Because it's, like I said, there's nothing in there either way. It's not prohibited. It's not specifically included. I'm just looking here. One of the questions, is it allowed to print the labels in 2 different languages? Yeah, I may have gone over that too quickly. It must be in Spanish, but the regulation does not say multiple languages. It must be in Spanish, but what I've talked with the authorities about, and they've told me informally in phone conversations, if you have another language on there, that's okay. But the primary language in terms of the most visible and so on has to be Spanish. We have the relationship we talked about. The label has, and some of these are academic, but they're specifically in the regulation as well. The label has to be firmly attached to or printed on the container. So you can't have labels, for example, that could tear off or are designed to be torn off, for example. The colors that you use, and this is how granular and how specific the decree gets. The colors that you use should not be anything that will take away, as they say, from the hazard pictogram. So, for example, if you have a flammable product and you have, the hazard pictogram in red and white, for example, you shouldn't have any colors on your label that are, in this example, red and white of a even remotely similar color to the colors of the pictogram. They say we don't want anything to take away. We want everybody to clearly identify the pictograms and not wonder, well, is this part of your marketing? Is this part of your company logo? Whatever it might be. They're very specific about that. Text should be legible. I think that's understandable, but it's in the regulation itself. And that it must stand out from the background. So again, they're very specific about how visible the language and the hazard statements are, or hazard pictograms are, on your product label. You have to make sure it's visible. People can look at it and easily see it, and it'll easily stand out. So there's not a question of, well, what's the information here on the where is it? Is it hidden? Is it small font? Because whatever the reason might be, they're very specific about that. And also specifically, they give a specific table, we'll see on the next slide, in the decree talking about the size, depending on the size of your product container. So for example here, they talk about the minimum label surface size. Excuse me, so if your container is smaller than 50 milliliters, well, there isn't a minimum label surface size because you're talking about a very small container. But the minimum pictogram size is 0.5 centimeter by 0.5 centimeter. That's the minimum. Of course, you probably couldn't do it on 50 milliliters, but if you wanted to, you can always make them bigger. They just talk about a minimum size. So when you're talking again with your sales and marketing groups and they're designing product labels and so on, you have to make them aware that in Chile, there are specific requirements, as we saw, for fonts and colors, but also for label size. They can't just say, well, for whatever reason, I want the label to be this big. If this big is not compliant in Chile with this table, they're going to cite you for it. When they find out, they're going to say that's not consistent with the table that we presented in Decree 57. Question, which regulation should we follow when it comes to exporting to Chile? Yeah, I don't know if you were on the beginning of the call, but I said Decree 57 has replaced 2245. So Decree took all these things. I think on the first or second slide, we listed all the previous regulations. Decree 57 basically took all of those, made it one regulation. So everything is now, almost everything is included in Decree 57. So make sure you follow that and not the 2245. And again, as you see here, as your package size increases, there are specific minimum label size itself. The label physically itself has to be a certain size, and then, or at least a certain size. And then the minimum size of the pictograms gets bigger and bigger, obviously, as you get a bigger label. And again, coming from industry, as I said a moment ago, your sales and marketing people may say, well, this is, corrosive, and, we have to say that it's corrosive by GHS, but we don't want to, advertise it or promote it. So we want to make it a certain size on the label that, maybe isn't as visible. You can't do that in Decree 57. These are the minimum requirements that you have to follow for doing that. Safety data sheets, just wrapping up the last couple slides. Safety data sheets are the normal 16 section that most people are familiar with. They must be printed in Spanish. Again, we've heard that as long as it's in Spanish, you can have an English copy attached to it. We've not asked the question if you could have, for example, the hazard statement in Spanish and then the hazard statement in English or Portuguese underneath it. We can certainly ask that if someone has a query. We can certainly make that conversation, make that call and have that conversation. Must be provided to the recipient. The regulation says only if it's determined to be hazardous. So some companies that I've worked for in the past outside of Chile have said, you know what, we're just going to create safety data sheets for everything. And because we just want to know that we always have a safety data sheet going to our customer or our warehouse or whatever it might be. That's fine. But you only need to have it per the regulation if it's considered to be a hazardous substance. And again, that's in Decree 57. The following phrase you see here must be in Section 16. There's no flexibility on it. And you see English and you see Spanish. Call your attention to the fact the Spanish translation that's on this slide is specifically taken from the decree. So if you say, well, I have somebody in the local, in country who speaks Spanish and they can do the translation of that English statement, as long as it's consistent with what's in the regulation, which is this particular Spanish translation, it would be okay. But again, I call your attention because the decree doesn't say, here's what you have to say on there, translate it. It says, this is the translation. It's written into the decree. So I would say, simplest thing from my point of view, from industry, just cut and paste it, excerpt it, do it word for word. Shouldn't have any issues. Okay. So some recommendations for industry, and for those of you that weren't on the call in the beginning, For safety data sheets, the question is from Michelle. Do we need to follow Decree 57, not 2425? Yes, because Decree 57 talks about hazardous pictograms, talks about, remember we saw earlier, hazard classifications for those 4,000 odd substances. Everything has been combined essentially into 57, whereas you had all these other standards before. Now you have 57, which gives you that information. Question, does CRC, child-resistant closures, intended for household use in Decree 57 or other regulations? There are CRC, child-resistant closure regulations, but they're generally in their consumer products regulations in Chile. They're not in Decree 57. So if you're talking about consumer goods for household uses, I have seen those type of regulation talking about the closure and so on of products, but not in Decree 57 purposely. So again, coming from industry, like I talked about in the beginning, one of the things I think we bring is we can talk specifically with different groups in your company about how you comply with, and here are a couple of thoughts I had initially. First of all, educate those in your organization that these requirements are in place. As I talked about with sales and marketing, you know, they may want to do something and they want to present it a certain way, and that's great, but make sure they're aware of they have certain obligations that they must do the labels in certain ways. They must do the hazard classifications if it's one of those 4,000 substances in a certain way. So make sure they're involved, and you can find a way hopefully to be compliant with the label and also let them say what they want to say from a marketing standpoint. One of the things that we used when I was in industry, and I'm not promoting it other than I'm familiar with it, is make sure you have tracking and reporting tools in place, because as we saw earlier, you're going to have to track your volumes going to Chile within the next several years and report them through that electronic portal. One of the companies, or two of the companies I used to work with in industry, we use the SAP EHS module. And I only present that because I'm familiar with it. I know it does the things that you will need to do to comply with Chile. We track formulations in there. We created SDSs in there. We created labels in there. So from my experience, it was very useful in meeting what Chile is going to require. Make sure you conduct regulatory due diligence on your suppliers. Make sure that your suppliers that send product into Chile, for example, if you have a manufacturing facility there, that they are sending it with a compliant label and a compliant data sheet. Some manufacturers have said, you know, if I don't know if there's a regulation in place, I'm just going to send an English safety data sheet, for example. And we've learned earlier that will not work in Chile. You have to have at least a Spanish version available, and then you can have English attached to it or however you want to do it. So make sure they're aware that there are requirements in Chile for those types of products. We talked about this again, establish a relationship with a tox center in Chile, and I'm happy to give you the company that I worked with. I'm not recommending them. I'm not recommending them. It's a company that we started the dialogue with, and they said we have the ability should you ever need it. So I'm happy to pass their information on to you with that caveat that it's not a recommendation, and it's not a recommendation. And then those of you that aren't, some of you get our regulatory updates down there. There's a link again that goes to our website where the alert section is. You complete the form. We send out alerts monthly, a one-page document that has clickable links to these articles and so on that are posted. We also send out when there are things that come up quickly. For example, when Israel decided they were going to implement their GHS regulation a little bit ahead of schedule last year, we send out emails immediately and alert everybody. In that example, you thought you had this amount of time, but Israel has moved it up. Make sure you're aware. And there's obviously no cost for doing that. So just going to our final slide here. Thanks for everyone for making the time. And I know it's, at least on the East Coast of the United States, it's a bit early. We have our contact information there, just m4globalconsultingllc.com. You can see anything you want. You can see past webinars. As I said in the beginning, we have a YouTube channel. There are links on there to the YouTube channels, to the presentations, where I've had the opportunity to speak on topics. There are links to those presentations. I think it's very useful. And just for some of you who weren't aware, maybe we try to do one a quarter regulation webinars throughout the year. We have the GHS and the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is essentially, think of it as the EU of Middle East in terms of their regulations and so on. They've begun implementing GHS. That happens in June. One of the ones that I always get a lot of people signing up for is the South America regulatory updates. South America is so dynamic, and you've seen it here with Chile, constantly putting out new regulations, getting things into place, changing regulations. It's very, very dynamic. You need to stay on top of it. That's going to happen in September. And then one I've had a lot of questions for at the end and beginning of November, cosmetics in the Middle East. Yes, there are cosmetic regulations. They do exist, but they are country specific. So happy to talk about that. Again, these links are clickable. You can sign up and join. Again, no charge, and we're happy to have you on that. So last minute, any other questions people want to submit? I think I've answered all of them for those of you that are still remaining. Nanomaterials, languages, notifications. Last call for any questions. Thank you for everybody who's given me compliments. I appreciate it. I always try to make it as useful as possible and not academic. So hopefully I did that in this case. And again, you've got the email. You have any questions, send me a question. I'm certainly not going to bill you for it. I'm happy to help people understand their compliance obligations so that then in the future, if you need somebody to assist you, hopefully we're somebody that you consider. So thank you very much.